Okay, so I want to talk about one of my favorite secondary weapons in Warframe, and the weapon in particular is the Zymos because of its special effect whenever you get headshots. So this is just the build that I have. I've got a Riven for it, which is mainly one of the only reasons I even tried using this weapon is because I managed to get a Riven for it. And I also managed to get a good roll pretty early on, but I kept rolling it to see if I could get anything better. But this is a weapon that requires you to use the Hemorrhage mod, which basically turns impact statuses into slash statuses, with a 70% chance if the fire rate is below 2.5, which the Zymos has an extremely low fire rate. Not that it really matters because of its effect whenever you get a headshot, which is that it'll basically like CC the enemy that you shoot in the head. They'll grab their head and kind of like stop in place for a while, and then release a bunch of spores that will like basically heat seek towards enemies, and they typically do impact procs, and so obviously you want to turn that into the slash procs with Hemorrhage, and it can do a pretty decent amount of damage. It's pretty slow, and also there is a massive problem with the weapon, which is it doesn't work in very like tight corridors because the spores spawn above the enemy's head, pretty far above them actually, and if you're in a corridor they'll just spawn into the ceiling and not do anything. So it really only works in areas with very high ceilings, unfortunately, and but other than that, it's pretty decent with the build that I have. Obviously, there are some tweaks that I could make to make it a little bit stronger. If my Riven was a little bit different and had cold damage, I could switch out Deep Freeze for Galvanized Shot to get more damage with Citrine, because I really like using this thing with Citrine because of her fourth ability and her third. You know, you send out a crystal that does a bunch of status effects, and her fourth freezes enemies in place, so you can basically just target one and then just watch as all of the other frozen enemies get killed, right? Basically just spam headshots on one guy. So it's pretty fun, and I also use this in Steel Path. It definitely works, but it's a bit slow to kill enemies because, you know, they're farther apart than in the Simulacrum where they're like kind of frozen. So it takes definitely a lot more shots than like when you're just simulating it with frozen enemies, but not by a substantial amount. It's just that the heat-seeking spores have to travel a little bit further, so, you know, it takes a bit more time for them to actually reach enemies, and they will spread out, targeting a bunch of different enemies all at once, and so the damage gets kind of spread out even further than it is like here. But anyway, that's pretty much everything that I wanted to say. I just love how this weapon sounds. It sounds amazing whenever you like all the spores just hit a bunch of different enemies at the same time, and you see a bunch of numbers everywhere. It's very fun. But I just want to briefly kind of show the Steel Path that I did using Citrine here. You know, just so you can see that it actually does kill Steel Path enemies, and I'm doing a Kuva Fortress survival mission just because I find this mission to be incredibly fun, and also it's an indoors map with very high ceilings. You can get kind of screwed over and get like the very, very tight corridors, which basically means that in that situation the Zymos is basically useless because the majority of its damage is just wasted on the ceiling, and it's not actually going to kill very many enemies. But in a corridor like this, it's very tall and wide. You know, you basically just headshot a few enemies and have a bunch of spores that heat-seek enemies, and they go pretty far too, so they don't terminate like a very short distance away from the enemy that you shoot, which is pretty nice. So you could basically just shoot one guy once or twice in the head, and then just move on to the next set of enemies, because chances are they're probably going to die. But Honestly, I don't have much faith in this thing because the build that I used previously kind of sucked. So I always tend to just shoot enemies a little bit more than I need to. And also, it can be hard to land headshots consistently. But with how often I'm using this thing now, I've gotten a little bit better at hitting headshots. So overall, it's just an extremely satisfying weapon, and you can kill acolytes with this thing, but I would just recommend having a very strong primary or melee weapon because it can take a while. Maybe if you freeze like a group of enemies around an acolyte, you just headshot a bunch of them, it could end pretty quickly, but you know, it's very like a situational thing that you'd have to try and go out of your way to set up. But anyways, that's everything that I wanted to say about the Zymos. It's an incredibly fun weapon. If you have it, I would suggest giving it a try with at least something close to the build that I showed here, because it's an incredibly fun and satisfying weapon when you get everything to work. But anyways, that's all.